Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Cinderella from 1950. Cinderella was a significant film for Walt Disney Studios. They really hadn't made a feature-length film since Bambi. Although they had films, they were compilation films. They weren't feature-length stories. Most of that is because of cutbacks during World War II and knowing that the foreign markets were absolutely gone during World War II. Yes, those were actually important then as well as they are now, but they were certainly important to an animated film and the Walt Disney Studios. Snow White was a huge success overseas. But the rest of the films couldn't even get released in Europe because it was like kind of bombed out and shit. So they just made these cheaper compilation films that weren't as financially successful, and Bambi and Pinocchio and Fantasia weren't huge hits on their initial release. The thing about Disney films, and the thing is, you probably wondering why I'm talking about history when it comes to a Disney film, is that they don't actually like to advertise what year these films came out. It's not like they can hide it. We still have Wikipedia pages and things like that. But their constant re-releases and re-video releases, and then on DVD, and then on Blu-ray, and then whatever format is after, they don't put that on there, and a lot of people don't initially understand when these films did actually come out. Especially as the films have gotten older, people tend to forget. A lot of Disney films didn't really make their money back until they got re-released a couple times, and then maybe on the second re-release, suddenly it was a giant success, and people were like, oh, it was always a success. But Pinocchio especially was a major financial disaster. Walt Disney Studios was actually $4 million in debt when they were making this film. This film was about $3 million itself, so they weren't in the best financial situation going into this. This film needed to be a hit, and it certainly was. It was a major hit. It was a huge hit. It was their biggest since Snow White, which they actually say on the poster of Cinderella, and it seems to be something they're really sticking towards. It's actually their second kind of Disney princess thing, I guess you could say. The financial success of this film helped Disney eventually build the empire to what we know it is today. It actually is that significant in its financial success. And it's quite a beautifully animated film. This is actually the first animated film of the infamous and incredibly influential and important Nine Old Men. This is the first film they all worked on together, the first feature film they worked on together. This is the first time that Disney owned their own sheet music to sell that off. It has a lot of firsts that Disney would later learn to capitalize on, a lot of different things, but it's also one of their classic fairy tale films because of the beautiful animation, because of the beautiful backgrounds, the amazing framing. It shows a transition because it does feel like what are considered the classic Disney films, which kind of starts with Snow White, ends with Bambi, and there's that weird interlude of just compilation films for a bit. This is actually like the 12th Disney animated film, but creatively it kind of has a little bit more to do with those initial Disney classics. It's like a combination of their short compilations and those classic Disney films. In a way, it's kind of a transition film, but not in that weird way that you consider a transition film. It's very classically done, but almost classically done in a very suburban 50s style, but in a really lovingly, beautifully drawn and executed way that you know and love from the Walt Disney Studio. A beautiful girl named Cinderella who is made to do janitorial work for her evil stepmother and her two evil stepsisters who are totally ugly, so they're more hateable and stuff. And then eventually, after she's cleaning, and you see she's friends with all these mice who she makes clothes for, which is not at all weird, but in this movie they make it so it's not weird. But if you knew someone who made clothes for mice, you'd be like, whoa, you fucking crazy girl. In this movie, it works, so there's no way you're not looking at her life and thinking it's sad. But until I really thought about it, I was like, that's kind of fucking weird that she makes clothes for her mice. People get weird when people make clothes for their dogs and their cats. After the king of the land expresses that he really would love to have grandchildren before he dies, so he decides to have a ball for the prince who's coming back to town. He insists that all eligible maidens in the land be allowed to attend this ball, and of course, since Cinderella is technically an eligible maiden, she is allowed to attend the ball, but the evil stepmother gives her tons and tons of chores to do so that she cannot possibly finish before it's time. But the mice make her a dress, and of course her evil stepsisters rip it apart, only to have her fairy godmother, who kind of comes out of nowhere, make her an amazing dress and a coach, and she goes and falls in love with the prince, and then he has to find her using the glass slipper that she left behind to try to find his true love, even if the stepmother won't allow it. Cinderella was kind of one of my beloved loved Disney films as a kid. It was one of the Disney films I watched quite a few times, in fact, way too many times when I was a kid. And I'm not exactly sure what my attraction to this movie has always been. I've always kind of favored it. Even when people are like, oh, it's not actually that good, my wife wouldn't actually watch it with me. And certainly script-wise, I'm not going to disagree with anyone. It does feel like they wrote out the plot to Cinderella and went like, wow, we are like super short on time on this. Let's put some mice in here to fill in all the gaps. The mice, I think, is Gus and Jacques. They occupy way too much of the plot of this film. The king occupies a lot of the plot of this film. And I looked at other versions of Cinderella, and they're actually a lot longer than this movie. But the interesting thing is that this film is the most memorable, and it's not just because it's a Disney film. Part of it is the style of it, part of it is the animation to it, and I actually think the mice are really fun characters. Certainly in a lot of ways they are just playing comic relief. They kind of talk in half Scooby-Doo, half like the minions from Despicable Me kind of speak, although this predates both those things, but that's kind of how I interpret how they talk. You're kind of compelled by them, and also because the character of Cinderella and the prince are almost like exceptionally more beautiful than everyone else in the film, who feels a lot more cartoony. The only one who's a little less cartoony and their character design's a lot more honed in is the stepmother. It feels like everyone else, like the stepsisters, the king, and his henchman guy, they're all more cartoony. And when they're goofy, it never feels as organic. It feels kind of stupid. It's nothing you're really as compelled by. But for some reason, the mice, maybe it's just because I can accept it more as a viewer. Maybe it's because they're better characters. Maybe it's because it's more fun. It is a little weird to have a film just diverge and to have them getting stuff for the dress and have a huge sequence on that and have another sequence about the mice and have them build the dress. It was kind of a weird way to diverge the plot and have all these like different plot elements going on rather than just straight tell the story of Cinderella. I kind of wonder what the rationale behind that was. Was it because you look at the compilation movies, you have all these shorts going on within it, and almost feels like each of their little adventures is like a different little short, and then you cut back to the story of Cinderella. It's very flawlessly done, I will say, but I don't think it has the plotting and the structure and is as well written as Snow White. Now, Snow White was Disney's first film. It was the first big animated hit. Cinderella, the backgrounds are exquisitely well done. Some of the shots, that shot of when she goes into her stepmother's room, the light from the window is hitting her, is amazing. And it's kind of almost classic late 40s Hollywood with that beautiful kind of Technicolor film going on in this movie. It reflects its time period. You look at the late 40s, and this was made throughout the late 40s. This came out in 1950. That kind of Hollywood glamour, Cinderella embodies it more than a lot of the films that tried to embody it in the films that you think of from this era do. And I think that's one of the things that's so amazing about this movie is it represents glamour in a lot of ways when she becomes Cinderella. When you think of what a princess is, I think you really think of Cinderella. She almost looks like someone like Princess Di would. This film isn't taking itself too seriously. It has those goofy elements. I think if it was just from her perspective, it wouldn't be as captivating, but it is a little weird narratively to just constantly be switching to all these different plots that feel like very different from your main character. This film was such a massive success. It let Disney actually form its own distribution arm and not have to be distributed through RKO anymore. They were able to afford to start building Disneyland. They were able to get into television production. They were able to make other films like Alice in Wonderland, Lady and the Tramp, Peter Pan, Sleeping Beauty. The 50s were a really fertile period for Walt Disney Studios. And you kind of look at everything that this film financially paid for. It feels successful. It feels influential. I don't know if it really is in the way that something like Snow White or Pinocchio or even the amazingness of the backgrounds of Sleeping Beauty. Certainly, you have to get over its 1950s-ness. It does feel like white suburban, not the car, but like white people in suburbia. Attitude towards design, especially the character of Cinderella and the music. I kind of look at it as the glory of that period. It's certainly very much in that period, but it really lovingly bathes itself in that and uses it to make a classic storybook tale. And Disney's always done that. If you look at their various films and you see the era they're made within, you can actually tell. That's kind of why people don't really like it, because when you associate 1950s suburban housewife kind of stuff, you automatically think it's lame. But I think this film's actually fairly good at it. It is a really beautiful princess tale in a lot of ways. You really do feel for the character of Cinderella. A lot of the characters, particularly the prince, who actually, I learned before I saw this, and I have to agree, they never call him Prince Charming. He's just the prince throughout it. We've just all accepted that he's Prince Charming. But he is pretty charming. He looks charming. I'd dance with him. I'm just saying. Cinderella is a really compelling character, and you get a really great arc with her. Really understand her plight. You're like, man, it would really suck to just do all these chores all the time. That ridiculous list of chores that seems like insurmountable, but she can sing and drift off into a fantasy land while you see these bubbles go on. This film's very good at, you get her side of it. I kind of think maybe we could have gotten more of that. The prince just isn't very well developed. We don't know much about him. The fact that other characters, it's almost so streamlined that they got rid of all of that, but they also got rid of all of that to have these weird segues with the mice and the king and all this stuff that you don't necessarily need. Well, we took all this stuff out, but it's like they went a little too crazy. Certainly films called Cinderella and you need to have that arc, but it almost feels like there's all this other stuff that would have been interesting to go into. I don't think anyone would really say this is one of their best written films, and certainly sometimes with the classic Disney films the writing isn't its strong suit, but the animation certainly is. And I can almost see why people in this era like absolutely loved it and went bonkers for it, and why it was a huge hit and brought back the studio and was a significant film within their filmography and in the development of Walt Disney, and now they own half the world and everything because of the success that Cinderella laid out. Now, it wasn't as interesting as like, look at what was going on at Warner Brothers at the time. Look at the Disney short works. This film does feel a little more conservative, and I'm not talking about the 50s thing. I'm saying in the animation, they don't really go as crazy as they really could. That's kind of the thing about a film like Cinderella. You look at Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan, they really go for it in those films. But in Cinderella, it feels a little more contained. Even though this film was considered risky, this film isn't very surreal, or it doesn't have that feeling of animation that anything can happen. But I think in a more conservative animation way, it kind of does when you think of how Cinderella's fairy godmother just kind of shows up, and that's her only appearance, and there's no groundwork laid out that she could possibly just show up out of nowhere. But you kind of believe it. That energy's still in it. There's a lot been made that Walt Disney got a lot more conservative. If you look at the Mickey Mouse shorts, again, I'm not talking about politically, but if you look at the cartoon shorts of Mickey Mouse at the beginning, he's like this rapscallion. He's twirling around cats on their tails and being like pretty mischievous. And then you get to this period and you look at Cinderella and you don't really see that energy. Now, that had been 20 years. He was a lot older. He had a big business. He had a lot on the line on this film, but it doesn't really feel like a ballsy, crazy movie. It just feels like a very streamlined, very pampered kind of Hollywood glamour kind of film. But I think Disney pulled it off. Disney really hadn't done that kind of like glamorous kind of film before this. This is kind of unique in a lot of ways. It's just not unique in that way that makes you, shout from the hills about how crazy and different animation is. Not every artistic success has to do that. The animation is beautiful. That sequence where she's running away from the castle when it's midnight, those riders following her, the black and red are just absolutely gorgeous. If this was the film they were going to go out on, sure, it's not anywhere near what the original 5 Disney films are. It's not what Fantasia, Pinocchio, Dumbo, Snow White, and Bambi were, but it's still nonetheless impressive. Some of the successes of an animation studio is when they can pull together and make a different kind of movie, and for them, Cinderella actually was, and it was a return to form for them as well, is trying to have a major hit with a narrative kind of film. They hadn't done that since the early days of the war when they surrendered the studio over to make lots of propaganda, and then he came and made a princess movie. I've always kind of liked the classic tale of it. I don't like it as much as I did when I was a kid. I can still respect and wonder at the beautiful animation of Disney. The top of their game watching the 9 Old Man animate. Ub Iwerks was a special advisor on this film. Walt Disney was still producing the films at this point, and that's still an amazing thing to watch. I think it's probably one of the better films of the period. I like it more than Alice in Wonderland, certainly. A beautiful kind of princess film where you earnestly and honestly, it does feel like an underdog story, but an underdog story with a lot of gloss and glamour to it, only the way Disney could really do it. And it shows the pros of that style in that studio and how well they could really execute it. They used to make these amazingly beautiful, traditionally animated films, and Cinderella is certainly in that tradition. So if you have seen Cinderella and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And yes, I will have a review of the live action Cinderella in a couple days. And thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.